3 Sobieski arrived to assist the defenders. The Ottomans fled the city in disarray, marking a decisive defeat for the Turks from this point onwards. The Ottomans would go into sharp decline and never really recover the heights of power that they had enjoyed previously. A combination of factors contributed to this downturn, including corruption within the government, a series of unimpressive sultans, and economic mismanagement that left the state struggling to support its massive army. The result was that starting in the 17th century, the Ottomans found themselves on the defensive more often than not as their neighbors sought to chip away at the empire's landmass. In the Balkans, the Venetians retook many of the islands which had fallen to the Ottomans earlier, such as the Ionian Islands and Crete. Meanwhile, the Habsburgs in Austria grew increasingly ambitious and seized Belgrade in 1687, kicking off the war for the Polish succession, in which the Ottomans were decisively defeated and lost territories in Hungary and Ukraine to the victorious Austrians. It looked like the Russians may present yet another challenge too. The Ottomans in the mid-17th century, when they invaded Crimea, but the Crimean Khanate, who had already broken free of Ottoman control in the early 1600s, managed to repulse the Russian invasion and remained independent throughout the rest of the century. During this time, several other powers started to rise up, which threatened the Ottomans. Hegemony in the eastern Mediterranean and North African regions. These included the French and Dutch, who had colonized large parts of Africa and the Americas and used their resources to establish navies that challenged those of the Portuguese and Spanish. On the high seas, consequently, war broke out between the Ottomans and the Dutch over control of the crucial Mediterranean trading posts of Aden and Yemen. The Dutch won the conflict and ousted the Ottomans from this important port. Moreover, the British East India Company successfully drove the Turks out of the lucrative spice trade and restricted their access to the markets of Asia. The effect of these setbacks was to leave the Ottoman economy stunted and largely irrelevant to the increasing globalization of trade in the late 17th and 18th centuries. As such, the Ottomans failed to benefit from the global exchange of goods and ideas that was taking place at the time. Domestically, the empire was afflicted by a severe drought and earthquake in 1718, which devastated Istanbul and killed hundreds of thousands of people. In the meantime, the Manchu dynasty of China had become increasingly powerful and had recently conquered Russia. So in order to prevent themselves from being attacked on two fronts, the Ottomans paid tribute to the Chinese emperor in recognition of his superiority and secured peace along their eastern border. However, there were still challenges for the Ottomans in the Caucasus and Central Asia, where the Fevids and the Zands posed a constant threat to the empire's northern and western flanks. In the middle of the 18th century, the Afghan Shah Durrani invaded Ottoman territory and sacked the city of Baghdad, although he was ultimately repelled. The fact that Shah Ismail had invaded and taken territory from the Ottomans marked the first time that Iran had been successful in doing so, and prompted the Ottomans to enter into an alliance with the Russians to stop any future advances from the Persians. By the end of the century, the Ottoman territories stretched from the banks of the Danube and the Balkan Peninsula to the Red Sea in the south and east of Egypt, across the Arabian Peninsula to the shores of the Caspian Sea in Azerbaijan and northwest Iran, as well as the Maghreb region of North Africa, which stretched from the Atlantic Ocean in Morocco to the Mediterranean coast of Libya. The late 18th and early 19th centuries saw the Ottomans struggling to maintain even a semblance of independence against growing pressure from external powers. This resulted in 3 wars against the Russians and 2 wars against the British, neither of which went well for the Ottomans. They also faced a rebellion in their North African possessions from the French, who established their own colonies in Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. The situation was further complicated by the rise of nationalism amongst their subject populations, especially in the Balkans, who began demanding autonomy and self-rule. The first wave of these nationalist movements was led by the Serbs, who rebelled against the Ottomans in 1804 and established their own semi-independent state. Other revolts then followed in the surrounding Balkan provinces, such as in Greece and Romania, which prompted the Ottomans to ask the Russians to put down these rebellions for them, which was no problem for the Tsar, since he had designs on the Ottoman Empire himself. The result was the Russo-Turkish War of 1828 to 1829, which ended with a decisive Russian victory and further territorial losses for the Ottomans, including the loss of the city of Constantinople to the Russians in 1829, despite the intervention of Britain, France and Prussia, who wanted to restrain Russian ambitions. The outcome was that the Turks were forced to cede most of the remainder of their Balkan territories in this war, including Moldova, Wallachia, and Serbia, while also losing the possession of their capital. The Greeks had already been granted their independence by the Allies in 1829 and established the modern Hellenic Republic. Meanwhile, the British took advantage of Ottoman weakness to acquire Hong Kong and the right to administer the Strait of Malacca, further undermining Ottoman power in the east. Then in 1839, the Saudis launched a jihad against the declining Ottoman Caliphate, forcing the latter to sign the Treaty of Quds, where they recognized Saudi control over the Hijaz and allowed them to keep Mecca and Medina, thus establishing Saudi. The Ottoman Empire is one of history's longest-lasting civilizations. So here's its entire history from beginning to end in just under 10 minutes. So the Ottoman Empire started out as the Ottoman Beylik, was a small Turkish state in Northwestern Anatolia, but in 1299, Osman I made himself the first sultan of the Ottomans, and he laid down the foundations of what would become one of history's most fearsome dynasties. His successors, Orhan Murad and Bazid, set about expanding Ottoman territory into the Balkans, defeating Serbia at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, where legend has it that the Ottoman troops overwhelmed the Serbian forces by riding into battle on horseback, swords in hand, firing pistols at the same time, all while chanting Allahu Akbar. It was the biggest cavalry charge in history, with 18,000 horsemen charging into the Turks' incumbent. The defeat at Vienna marked a turning point for the Ottoman advance into Europe, after which they would gain no further ground on the continent as the late 17th century progressed into the early 18th. The Ottoman Empire began to slowly stagnate and enter into a relative period of decline. Much of this was owed to the complacency of the sultans of this period, who had over time gradually taken a more backseat approach to the governorship of their empire. To this, the Ottoman system of government, which was headquartered in the Topkapi Palace in Constantinople, had generally seen active and engaged. Sultans take a direct role in the affairs of the empire, especially early on in the 15th and 16th centuries. However, with each passing generation, the day-to-day decision-making increasingly fell to the Grand Vizier, who acted as prime minister, and a small army of officials and administrators. All the while, the sultans passed much of their time away in their harems and gardens. The governance of the empire was largely decentralized in its approach, insofar as taxes were collected from the provinces to maintain a large army, but the regions themselves also had a fair degree of autonomy under local rulers and governors. It was also a tolerant empire, whilst conversion to Islam was beneficial to those looking to advance at the social hierarchy. It was by no means mandatory. Christians and other religious adherents were accepted under the Ottoman Empire, and it even became a primary haven for Europe. Jews who faced persecution and expulsion from countries like Spain during this era. Cities such as Thessaloniki became centers of religious cosmopolitanism in the early modern era, with a majority of 54% of its population being Jewish by as early as 1519. The Ottoman Empire was also initially a very wealthy one, with extensive trade networks that flowed from as far afield as India and China, along the Silk Road through to cities like Constantinople, Alexandria, and Egypt, as well as Antioch and Damascus in the Levant. Over time, however, as the center of world economic activity shifted from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, large ocean-going vessels carrying trade out of the Americas in the Far East effectively bypassed the Ottomans and reduced Europe's reliance on the overland trade routes that passed through their territory, effectively making them obsolete. With this economic stagnation and imperial decline, the Ottoman Empire began to fall behind its European rivals, who were themselves experiencing a scientific revolution, with developments being made on all fronts. Due to rapid advancements in technology as the 18th century progressed, the Ottoman position came to be seen as less of a threat and more of a weakness that could be exploited with the lands they had conquered in centuries, past now looking ripe for reclamation. Russia and Austria in particular began to take the fights to the Turks. Seizing Ottoman-controlled lands along the northern shores of the Black Sea, the Caucasus and the Balkans. Meanwhile, in North Africa, the local governors began to exert growing levels of independence, and by the end of the 18th century, Algeria, Tunisia, Cyrenaica, and Egypt were practically sovereign in all but name. As pall as the situation was for the Turks in the 18th century, it was soon eclipsed by the events of the 19th, as the Ottoman Empire became known as the sick man of Europe. As early as 1804, an uprising occurred in Serbia, which immediately called the Ottoman control over the Balkans into question. The steady fracturing of the empire continued in subsequent decades, with the Greek War of Independence breaking out in 1821. This led to the emergence of an independent Greek state by 1829, which was supported economically and militarily by Great Britain, France, and Russia, who were eager to see the Ottoman presence in the region decline for their own benefit. A year later, the nominal Ottoman hold on Algeria was ended entirely when France invaded and began establishing its own colony there throughout the 19th century. But more notably, during the 1850s, Russia looked to expedite the decline of the Ottoman Empire, further by advancing into their territories around the Black Sea. Unlike in previous instances where the Western, Christian powers sought to capitalize on such an opportunity and enjoy the fighting against the Turks, Britain and France did not want the Ottoman Empire to collapse in its entirety. This was in part to preserve the balance of power in Europe, with no one nation controlling too much territory or exerting too much influence. They subsequently joined the conflict in defense of the Ottoman Empire, with the Crimean War being fought, somewhat successfully, to bring much-needed respite to the declining power of the Turks. Nevertheless, in the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s, emerged out of the Ottoman provinces in the Balkans as Romania and Serbia declared themselves independent and Bulgaria became increasingly autonomous. The Empire of Austria-Hungary and Russia once again continued in their relentless attacks at the expense of the Ottomans in the Balkans and the Caucasus. By the early 1910s, when Italy had seized Libya from their control and Albania had established itself as an independent nation, there were growing talks amongst the European powers of dissecting what remained of the Ottoman Empire and dividing it up between themselves. This seemingly never-ending period of decline led to growing concerns amongst the Ottoman Empire's younger generations, many of whom identified as Turkish nationalists and called for political reforms to mitigate the empire's downturn and hopefully rejuvenate its prospects after 200 years of stagnation. At the forefront of this movement were the Young Turks, a group which wanted to replace the